Welcome to the State of CRM podcast. This is Matt, and today I'm excited to announce we have a special guest joining us. It's been a few weeks since we've had a guest on the podcast, so really excited to have a new layer of expertise joining us. This person has deep experience in technology and marketing technology specifically. So I'd like to introduce Cory Munchbach, who comes from BlueConic. She's the Chief Operating Officer there, and we're really excited to have a conversation with her today about sort of some of the shifts and trends we've seen over the past 2 years, but really within the context of how it has sort of impacted technology and the way that marketers should sort of be looking at potential partners, how they've changed, how they haven't changed, and a little bit around sort of like how what marketers should be sort of expecting from their technology partners and how they can measure that success within their business. So enough about that. This is all about you today, Cory. So very excited to have you, and thank you so much for joining. Love to learn a little bit about you and what you're doing right now.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for having me, Matt. Super excited to be here. So as you said, I've covered the marketing technology space for a long time. Before I joined BlueConic, which was coming up on 7 years ago, I had been an analyst at Forrester Research where I was covering the marketing technology space. I actually originally started working on the CMO and marketing leadership team when I joined the company, which was great because I got a very wide sort of marketing strategy perspective in the research that I was involved in initially. And then a little bit later moved into covering the marketing technology piece specifically. And a big theme always for me has been sort of that interplay between strategy, goals, and how the technology is kind of architected to support those in some ways, sometimes better than others. And then when I joined BlueConic, for me, that was a really opportunity to even go one layer deeper, right? To become an operator, to be in the space, working more directly with our customers. So it's been, great journey of a wider lens and just kind of honing in on that further and further over the last 10 years or so.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a lot of like great relevant experience. And I think, our listeners are always kind of wondering, they're thinking about like, how do I sort of not only just like measure the success of technology partners, but how do I even start? Like there's so many players out there in the space, like just layers and layers of technology and different options. And I think like, especially now we've seen this, like we talked a lot about it on the podcast, these seismic shifts in consumer behavior, from obviously people staying at home more to now like going out in the world a lot more with various levels of comfort. The way that people shop is different. It's become, it's been the age of digital for 20 something years now.
Yeah.
Sort of acceleration happen in really unique and interesting ways. Some of that might return to normal, but I think a lot of it potentially won't as well. And kind of like, kind of based on some of the things that you're seeing and thinking about, like, how are you sort of like, are there certain trends that you're seeing right now that you think are, significantly impactful, or like the things that marketers should really be kind of looking out for in terms of the way that they're actually going to have some significant impact in the technology solutions that are being developed right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's been an interesting year and a half for a lot of reasons. The obvious one being the pandemic, certainly, and the broader kind of seismic shifts that come around with that. But it's also happening to coincide with a few other big shifts that I think are of equal, if not maybe in some ways more relevance to kind of a wider array of marketers and their sort of business partners. So for me, the one that has been certainly top of mind in 2021 has been the deprecation of the third-party cookie, this move just aggressively away from third-party into first-party alternatives, general alternatives, just trying to figure out what the world looks like if kind of the core currency of advertising does in fact go away. And Google extended the runway a little bit by delaying that from this year to 2023. But in many ways, that inevitability has persisted for some time. And it's going to be brief, if anything. But I think what that also told us at the time was how few marketers were really ready for that to be turned off. We can talk about, the Google piece, but it reminded me a lot of a few years prior when GDPR rolled out and everyone knew March 25th or May 25th, 2018 was coming for quite some time. And that day rolled around and there was a whole lot of sort of panicked and hand wringing and not sure what we're doing. And I think that is going to be another example of a shift that people just really aren't getting adequately ready for. You mentioned COVID. I mean, I think for me, what the takeaway from COVID was one of the complete lack of real business agility and resilience, or in some cases, the companies who had really been agile before and were able to adapt really quickly were the ones who were either not disrupted or in some cases even able to take advantage of some of those buyer trends and just sort of what was going on in the broader world. And for me, like, let's hope against all hope that the pandemic and something of that cataclysmic impact is not in our near future. But the reality of it is that events of that can kind of happen day in and day out in ways that, marketers and brands could be taking advantage of, but aren't. It's sort of the under-penetration of testing and just, again, like a lack of real agility. And I think that's a huge miss. I think brands that can move more quickly, not just with clever tweets, but actually really at a sort of operational level, there's a huge amount of opportunity that's going untapped there. And I think COVID kind of revealed where everyone was in that journey, even though we've been talking about it for a while. And then I think the third one, and obviously relevant for you guys as well in this sort of broader topic, is this continued sort of evolution of what the customer relationship really looks like and what that entails. And I am increasingly convinced of a world in which we're sort of entering a phase where privacy and consent are going to be components of brand and how everyone has to think about that relationship, that engagement model. And if you're not really starting from trust as sort of a ground zero, if you will, of everything about how you engage with the consumer, that's going to catch up with you. And obviously there are kind of connective threads between some of what I just talked about, but I think taken individually, they are massive, massive changes. Collectively, I think it really represents a pretty significant overall transformation that we'll see in the coming years.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I love how you kind of broke that down into three really interesting categories. You have sort of the COVID consumer shifts, focus on privacy, and then how can marketers create relevant experiences and get closer to their customers ultimately. And it's interesting, we've been following the iOS 15 update pretty closely, which has made it very difficult or will make it very difficult for marketers to use open rates specifically, as well as other points of data to optimize. But we're still seeing, kind of to your point around that slow shift or moving slowly, marketers not really reacting too quickly yet. And the impacts of it have been minimal so far, but it's going to get bigger over time as more consumers sort of adopt this and it starts impacting the way that they can measure and the data that they're receiving. And a lot of the partners that they're using, I think they're relying on these data points to be able to optimize and provide value for marketers. So your point around being nimble is we're still not seeing a lot of the players in the space, at least even on this particular point, evolving as quickly as they should. And so eventually at some point, marketers are going to be losing value because the solutions that they're trusting aren't really addressing this, but they're kind of at a point too, where they're not necessarily pushing for it just yet. To your point around GDPR, kind of once it happened, once the impacts were there, then it was like, oh gosh, now we have to be compliant. What do you think, why do you think some of these legacy players are so slow to adopt? And do you think they'll evolve, or where do you think the opportunity in the market really lies right now, considering things are changing so rapidly, but in a lot of cases, the technology is lagging a little bit?
Yeah, I think I would maybe put that in, there's sort of two sides of it, is that in some cases, the technology is so far ahead of where everyone needs to be. And that's actually part of the problem, whether it's been kind of shiny object syndrome or things like that, where there's just a misalignment, in my view, between the technology, whether due to the fact that it's old or it's too sophisticated, with what the company is actually trying to accomplish. And I don't limit that to marketing tech, but we can sort of focus there, of course, on what the way that manifests. But I think there's a kind of other element to this, which is that as everyone tries to grapple with it, marketing in general is quite conservative, right? I think there's actually sort of this misconception in a lot of ways about how, marketing is so cutting edge and right. And there's sort of, and I get that, right? That's awesome with Con, and there's sort of this cult of innovation and creativity, which is great, but it really is more limited to creative and less so about like, how does a marketing department operate, and what are we willing to do? And that can come, sort of brand restriction, but all the way down to the fact that historically, right, marketing has had somewhat of a limited purview when it comes to some of the performance aspects, whether it comes to technology. And I think there's just still a real discomfort, oftentimes the marketers sort of not wanting to take on what it will require to be another part of the company that has access to the data. But also on the flip side, other parts of the company who's unwilling to share that data because there's sort of not a real trust model there. And so the result of it has been just a general kind of conservatism in terms of day-to-day and month-to-month kind of operations, even if marketing still has the reputation of being the one driving the big transformation with a lot of the big ambition around digital and all of that. And so I think, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but it does create, I think, a real gap between sort of what marketing is actually tasked with doing, what sort of the expectation set for them is, and then all of the accompanying kind of resources and structures that would allow them to be successful. I've seen this certainly with our customers, but dating well back to Forrester, sort of writing about these things. It's very actually unusual for marketing to truly be given, I think, kind of that carte blanche to go after some of the big initiatives that they're tasked with. And it creates kind of this bind for them in terms of what they can do. And the safer bet is to stay conservative and just sort of wait and see. In a lot of these cases, it's very rare that they get that real move ahead. And that's why you see things like the GDPR not being ready for cookies to go away and all of that so far in advance.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And we've seen that a lot too, talking to marketers as well, where just in terms of like the KPIs and the way that they're measured in terms of success versus what the business wants. So like kind of, we were talking a little bit about open rate, but marketers are still sort of, kind of relying on very marketing specific metrics for success in terms of, being able to grow things like open rate, click-through rate, things like that. I'm not saying they're not important, but, the business isn't growing on open rate. It's not growing on click-through rate. So if the business is focused on how are you driving revenue, but marketers are still sort of focused on capturing and optimizing towards metrics that may indicate revenue longer term, or maybe even not in some cases, there's sort of this disconnect between the business goals themselves and then the goals that marketers have, which has made it, I think, difficult for them to showcase the value of the technology that they're investing, obviously to their own team, but to the wider business as well. And I think like, it's really interesting that you sort of brought up that operational disconnect between the marketing team and the wider business, because I feel like it's sort of like in a lot of cases, a very unique challenge for the marketing team. They're kind of placed in a bit of a tricky situation where I think other departments don't necessarily have to deal with that quite the same way. Do you think, do you think that there are technology solutions that can help with that? Or like, is there sort of an approach that marketers should take when thinking about employing technology where maybe they can help bridge that gap a little bit? Like what's the move for marketers, considering that is a reality that I think almost every marketing team faces?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, first of all, it's stating the problem out loud, right? Which is that marketing teams never have the right resources relative to what they're being tasked with, whether that's in quantity or in skill set, or more likely a combination of both. I've never ever in all my time doing this met a marketing team that was perfectly content and like in a good place with what their resources kind of gave them. So I think that's one part of it. Another one is also this just constantly competing priorities. There's just this kind of goes to the agility point, but planning and strategy are much, much slower relative to the day-to-day reality, certainly of the consumer journey, but of sort of what marketing is dealing with. And so that creates a real competition there. And then, you talk about the sort of technology. I think it's twofold. It's what the technology is designed to do, but also, again, what the marketing team is tasked with. And from my standpoint, we can look at every performance KPI that marketing has ever looked at, and I don't think any of that is more than incremental, right? Nobody won the market because they nailed, their email open rates. They might have done something really unique and different that's a key driver. But the idea that any one of these tactics happens in isolation, first of all, is just not correct. And I think there's a combination of factors. And I think technology marketing can't get away from those types of metrics, but really we need to be looking at things that are much more about how does marketing operate, right? How quickly can you do certain things, right? What are the operational efficiencies that you can gain from having technology? And if you look at that and take a much more kind of like financial type of perspective, right? You're looking at this much more at a holistic level. All of a sudden, the math on technology changes dramatically, right? Because it's not a zero-sum game of did it make this go up or this go down? You're looking at top line, bottom line. If you have a marketing team of 100 people, again, always strapped, always trying to kind of catch up, and you save all of those people 10, 20, 25, 50% of their time because of technology that helps automate things, that's incredible, right? That's an order of magnitude more impact than having created maybe a lift of your emails by 1%, or at least at the same. And so, that to me is one of the biggest gaps in how technology is used and thought about today in marketing tech, is this sort of underside where the real magic is going to happen is the thing that's least accounted for and kind of least calculated in the overall return on investment that they're looking to the technology to get.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think like in terms of the type of technology that marketers are looking to employ, they're aware of this gap and this problem. And I think they're struggling a bit to figure out exactly what they need to solve it. We've kind of seen a couple different camps, and this is like specific to customer marketing, obviously, which is where kind of our realm is.
Mm-hmm.
And one is marketers sort of looking for like platform ecosystems where they can get everything from data warehousing, processing, storage to intelligence, data science, audience building to multi-channel activation all in one spot. And I think in a lot of situations, I don't want to call anyone out in terms of the platforms that are out there, but that promise of being able to do that in a seamless way, which might be able to solve for some of the challenges that you're mentioning, haven't really worked. Either systems don't speak well together, or there's too much of a tax on stakeholders to be able to get things deployed and implemented. So there's sort of that. And then there's this other area where you have either capabilities or solutions that are a bit more flexible, where marketers are looking for things that can fit well together, either as part of the same cloud ecosystem in a partnership perspective, or potentially solutions that are just designed to fit within a stack that they'd like to build. So, are you kind of seeing sort of that as well? Do you have any kind of like thoughts on sort of this closed platform versus maybe more of like an open ecosystem that marketers are looking to use? Are you seeing any sort of like movement in one direction or the other, or success?
Yeah, I think a couple of things on that. So one, I think I just, in interest of full disclosure, have to admit that I wrote the first wave on the marketing clouds. So I contributed to the creation of this monster in a way that I think I'm going to be paying the piper on for a long time. So I think that's an important piece of disclosure. So I've been watching this for a while. I think the other part I'll say though is sort of the macro element, which is if you take a wider aperture on even the last 30 years of technology, this pendulum swings constantly from sort of pure play, best of breed kind of solutions back toward more the platform side. And then it sort of goes back even into like IT owned kind of build first mentality. You always have companies that are squarely in each one of those camps, but even then this is very much something that happens cyclically. And I think, depending on where you are in that ecosystem, the market may be better or worse for you. I think for the marketing clouds and some of those platform plays, 2010 to 2015 was kind of the heyday of that, because you weren't dealing necessarily with the level of sophistication, and a lot of the components that made up the marketing clouds were still best of breed in their own right, and they were sort of slamming them together. Some of these solutions now, though, are 15, 20 years old, and you can't say that they're still best of breed. I mean, they're just not. Yeah. The thing that I will say is that, and this goes into my kind of general mentality on how to evaluate technology, it's sort of like thinking about buying or building a house, right? You can spend years and years looking for the perfect home, and you're going to lose a lot of time, but you might end up finding the perfect home. You can buy land and build the home. Again, a lot of time lost on that. You're going to run into problems with the contractors. it's going to cost you a lot more money and you have to maintain it, but you'll probably get maybe exactly what you want, at least when you started out, or you can sort of do in between. The reality of it is there's no perfect scenario here. There's always costs. And I think for me, one of the things that I always struggle with is that one of the reasons I love working with marketers and sort of the business teams is there's just like inherent level of optimism, right? There's so much excitement. They're charged with growth of the company. It's awesome. But there is usually a specious calculating of what are the trade-offs of some of this stuff. And there are just always trade-offs. It's either time, it's cost, or it's breadth. Somewhere there is no technology that exists that you can just buy off the shelf very quickly at a great price point. It just doesn't, that's not real. And I honestly don't think that will ever happen, but there's a little bit of this mentality of IT. Yeah, we'll do it better this time than we've ever done it before, right? Or like, we'll try the marketing cloud vendor option A and see what sort of happens. It's more about, for your organization, what is your tolerance for time delays? What is your budget, right? What kind of resources do you have? What are you looking to accomplish? Even that helps you triangulate on sort of which of those three places you want to be, the true build, so that platform type of build, or more of a build your own stack and sort of the pure plays. And they're not the same. There's really just very fundamental differences. And trying to compare and contrast them ends up being challenging. I obviously sort of have a predilection toward, software is so good today. The building it yourself thing is really, really hard to defend in my view, in terms of some of this stuff for marketing tech, maybe for product, different conversation. But the reality of it is like that's sort of what we're always dealing with. And I don't think we're ever going to outrun that cyclical nature of the technology and how we tend to manage it, nor the fact that there's going to be a lot of variety here and what's going to be right for you and your organization at any given point in time.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. And kind of the way you talk about marketers needing to understand really what they need to solve for and where their challenges lie, and then understanding in market what solutions can solve that. So like being able to think about kind of going full circle back, like not just, okay, what is going to, increase my email open rate, but is this part of a solution that can help me achieve some of those foundational operational problems and challenges that I face as well, as opposed to sort of just kind of looking for point solutions or even full stack solutions that just solve for certain things that I need at the moment, which is interesting. And we talk a lot about KPIs on the podcast, but one thing you've mentioned a few times is around sort of operational efficiency. And I'd love to kind of dig in a little bit more on that specifically and kind of get some of your thoughts on, like how can really, as a marketing team, how can they be, I guess, in a way, a catalyst for change and identify and find solutions that actually can create those operational efficiencies? Like how can a marketer even start going about doing that?
Yeah. So I love this question. So first of all, one of the things that I'm finding, and we sort of call this the princess and the pea problem of marketing tech, which is that so often the things that plague us, we don't realize until the pea has been removed, so to speak, right? And all of a sudden you're getting a great night's sleep. And we've talked about that for a long time. It's a wild under accounting usually of how many peas we're sort of sleeping on top of in this industry. Because if you actually start to ask the question, how many steps is it between, let's call it getting transactional data from your stores down to running a lookalike campaign against them, all of a sudden it's like, well, it takes us 2 to 3 weeks. We need this many vendors. It goes through these many hands. As soon as you kind of start to say that out loud and say, oh my God, I could cut that down from, let's call it, 10 steps and 4 weeks to 1 day or 2 days, like you don't even dare to think about that some cases, right? That all of a sudden you can do those things. And that is true, again, just to free yourself up to do more of what you're trying to accomplish or to free up people, right? You kind of go a lot of ways. And I think that number of steps and sort of proximity from data to interaction, no one is very good at estimating that when they think about it until they're kind of confronted with what's actually happening, right? There's a study a couple of years ago. If you ask someone, hey, how many times did you go to the gym in the last 30 days? And they'll say, oh, I went, 15 times. And then you look at the data, it's like they went 3. Like we're very good at sort of distilling down what we wanted to have happen and sort of ignoring what really did. And I think this is the case here too, right? If you don't appreciate or actually do a true accounting of all the costs of what goes into getting a campaign live or, doing an analysis, not just can you improve that, but the other thing that I would observe is how often you're not doing the stuff that you as a marketer often aspire to. And I'll give you an example of this. We see a lot of times, a lot of our customers who have been sort of locked into either like old agency type of relationships where they sort of own their data. And to get at it is multiple thousands of dollars to just pull one segment to either do a campaign, any sort of campaign. And by virtue of moving the data, in our case, into the CDP and being able to query it right there and create the segment, what that actually means is that, yes, there's the cost saving, but that was for one audience. So it's not a question like, oh, we just saved you, let's call it $5,000 per audience times 100 that you now have in your BlueConic implementation. You never had the 100 because of course you weren't spending that kind of money. And so like, that's to me where you start to think about not just automating what you're currently doing, but this incredible opportunity to now actually do this stuff at scale. It's the difference between, yes, we do personalization and we actually can do personalization at scale, or we can test at a high level without all of the opportunity cost that comes along with it. That to me, when you have conversations in depth with marketing teams and you get them to start talking about how they spend their time, but how they'd like to be spending their time, and then figuring out kind of what technology solutions of, that was just one example. There's plenty of others can help them to do that. That to me is where you really start to see the significant change in how they then go to market and drive business growth with what they're doing. And that's hard to get at. Without having some real trust built up, certainly, but giving them kind of permission to have those conversations and think about it in the Princess and the Pea context, as I said.
Yeah, I love that analogy, and I think your point about trust and kind of like cross-departmental relationships is really important. That is one thing that we've seen more and more on our end is. It's not just marketing teams making decisions about marketing technology. They're not sort of operating in isolation. We talk to marketing, we talk to finance, but we talk to IT as well, who have become like increasingly involved in conversations as it relates to whether or not marketing should invest in a particular piece of technology. And one thing we've kind of identified through some of those conversations is there seems to be sort of a disconnect. And in certain cases, we'll speak to IT departments that, we'll say marketing team doesn't need X, Y, and Z, but also the IT team is not being KPI'd on the things that the marketing team is, and actually fairly unfamiliar with the challenges they face. Like even just basic targeting or audience building, they're like, no, they have everything they need. But when you talk to the marketing team, they're like, no, we actually are seriously underdeveloped in being able to build segments, for example, or understand buying intent. And the IT team is not even aware of those challenges, yet they're a key stakeholder on sort of deciding whether or not marketing can even move forward. So it makes it really hard for marketing to be able to do that. Are you sort of seeing this tension sometimes between marketing and IT? And are there any things that might work from your perspective or experience in terms of marketing sort of being able to, I guess, bring IT into the fold in a way where maybe that's not so much of an issue, or IT can really be understanding and empathetic of what marketing needs to achieve?
Yeah, absolutely. And you already hit on one of them. And the first is, rowing in the same direction, having the same guidelines. And if, the goals are different and what you're trying to do is divergent. If IT is trying to, for example, focus on eliminating redundancy, that's going to look very, very different than if they're focused on giving marketing the right tools for the job, even if that does mean, in all likelihood, some amount of redundancy, and being really clear about that. And that's the problem, is that you end up having what IT is tasked with evaluating technology against just not overlapping, or at least not appreciating those trade-offs in a way that allows both sides to come to a compromise. It sort of ends up being like marketing one or IT one, as opposed to the business overall and ultimately the customer, winning and benefiting from the right technology selection. And we've been talking about this. I mean, Forrester did a massive sort of CMO CIO summit. In fact, I think it was 2012 or so, 2013, to start to have this conversation, right? So this has been going on for forever. And admittedly, I'm not sure I see that there's been a huge amount of progress, to be honest. I think the nuance of the conversation has gotten a little bit better, but ultimately, there's a lack of not just the shared objectives, but sort of general like approach, right? Like, how do we think about these things? And this idea of who actually owns kind of that customer relationship. This is a big area for me where I think if IT were tasked more with understanding what's happening with the customer and ultimately had a shared stake in that outcome, right? The growth of the business and some of these things related to how do we move into new business units, right? What is the broader strategy here? If IT had a role in that, we'd be having far more constructive conversations. But at the same time, marketing needs to step up, I think, and be a lot more fluent in GDPR, CCPA, right? How are they designing these programs to make sure that they are compliant, they put privacy at the center, that they work within a framework that IT provides, whether, again, it's redundancy or it's cost or what have you. I mean, if there's a lot that can be done, and a lot of middle ground that can be found. But I just haven't seen a lot of terrific examples of that happening structurally. And I go back to the point that I made before, which is that a lot of this is cyclical. And because, especially for larger enterprises, these are ongoing long conversations, and it's very easy for where it began, sort of the context and timing, to end up differently, right? If you imagine that you had this conversation this time in 2019, and all of a sudden here, March rolls around, everything's out the window, right? And so, again, that sort of goes to the point I made about agility. IT and marketing need to be tasked with figuring out how to make the organization more agile, along with some of those supporting functions as well. Which is why I think, it's funny that the part of the problem with marketing tech is that it continues to be thought of as marketing tech as instead of, business technology, right? This is about how the customer engages. How do you do direct to consumer? How do you use data science in a way that's compliant? These are far bigger business questions, and leaving them just to marketing to figure out, or sort of defaulting to IT to figure them out. It's really no wonder that we don't make a huge amount of progress against getting those things better aligned.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point. And just like aligning teams towards those larger business goals so that everybody is rowing in the same direction, whether they're efficiency-based KPIs or there's something to do with, bringing in revenue or profit or customer relationships, things like that. I think you hit the nail on the head, is that if you sort of measure every department against different like rulers of success, then you're of course going to have an organization that's sort of disconnected in that way. And I think that's a really, really interesting way to illustrate that. So kind of, I guess, like, wrapping up the conversation, I think we've talked about a lot of really interesting things around sort of misalignments, how technology can either exacerbate that or potentially help with that as well, what marketing teams need to kind of consider when kind of bringing new tech into the fold and getting it adopted internally, kind of looking into the future. We've talked a little bit about COVID and trends that have existed and may continue to exist. We've talked about technology shifts. Do you have any sort of like last pieces of advice or things that you think you'd like marketers to take away from today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest one, and I've been beating this drum now for a while, is this idea of use cases. And I think the best thing that marketing and marketers can do is write down in very explicit detail what it is that they're trying to accomplish, right? What is the situation today? What does it look like in an ideal world when you add the technology in? How will you measure, that it was successful? Who will be involved? What kind of effort, right? That we get a lot of use case sort of description of like, well, we want to do personalization, right? That's not a use case. That's sort of a initiative, I guess, right? It's sort of a broad thing, segmentation, not a use case, really describing your business situation, whether it's a problem or an opportunity, however you want to think about that. The more granular that you can be and thinking about what you're trying to accomplish with the technology, kind of creating briefs about that, what it will look like, supporting tech, that kind of legwork up front, first of all, will help you pick far better technology partners when you actually go into the evaluation. It will also do much to make more expedient your implementation process and onboarding because you have that clarity. Because again, I said this a little bit earlier, there are trade-offs, and that's just the reality of the tech. So knowing that going in, what are your absolute non-negotiables, right? Where can you maybe be a little bit flexible? And where is it sort of, okay, vendor, you tell us what the best practice is. You need to have that point of view to be in your own driver's seat. I think that ends up happening a lot, is that marketers, either for lack of experience or confidence, sort of can't drive in the direction they want. And there's a lot of relying on either external vendors, agencies, IT again, and then sort of dissatisfying where they end up. So I think having that ownership really starts with the use cases that you're describing. And again, folding in the metrics, both again, operational as well as performance, that you are going to hold yourself to account on. And then also sort of the ongoing documentation, being comfortable bringing IT in, making some of those core choices early on in the process. I think that sets up marketers for choosing the right technology in the first place and getting the most out of it over the lifetime of having that tool. And that's not going to look the same for everyone, but doing that kind of effort, it's night and day. If I think about sort of our own customer metrics, thinking about time from, signature to customer being operational with their first use cases, it is orders of magnitude faster for the customers who come in with those use cases documented, the channel owners identified, the data files. Like there's just some very basic, but a hugely impactful homework that you can and should do. And that will pay dividends for you on virtually every count. But it doesn't happen nearly often as often as it should. That would be my one big piece of advice going forward.
Yeah, that's interesting too. And I think when you were saying that, I was just thinking also that, marketers need to also place the expectation on the technology solutions that they're vetting to be able to understand that as well.
Yeah.
Like that solution, even if it is a marketing solution, should be able to have the right conversation with the IT department as well and sort of help be that catalyst for marketers. So I think it's something that they can kind of place as an expectation on the vendors that they're vetting. And if somebody can't do that for you, that's probably a serious red flag in terms of how effective it's going to be in helping solve those problems.
Absolutely. And I think it's also the work of not every organization, culturally is the same. It's totally fine if you're the kind of company that needs to have sort of quick early wins in order to get buy-in, right? So we're deliberately starting small, and this is what the roadmap to bigger looks like. Other companies, want to jump right in, and they're okay with it saying, yeah, this is probably more of like a 6-month implementation or whatever it might be. But we're going to do a lot more of that upfront work by design because we already have that buy-in. We did that work. And those are all kind of DNA of your organization, marketing team, broader context, full company. That should be part of this. I think there's no reason to think that sort of the softer side of this, should it matter how your cultural fit with the vendor is really important. And so that comes down to sort of the old adage of how much sales and software are still human businesses, even if we're doing a lot of this remotely or a little bit more automated. And it does have a material impact. What your appetite for these is crucial. And so don't shy away from that. Fold that into it and make sure that you're sort of setting expectations, and it'll make for everyone more successful, ultimately, right? You getting promoted, right? This is all good things when this is done right. And those are some of the ways to really maximize that success.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And I think, great advice for folks dialing in today. And I just want to thank you again for your time today. I think this was a really interesting conversation, something that I think we haven't delved too deeply in the podcast in the past. So we're really excited to add sort of your layer of expertise into this. And I'd love to hear from the audience as well in terms of, are these challenges they're facing? You know, is disconnect existent? Please, by all means, reach out, comment, let us know if this is something you're facing, and also if you're solving it. Tell us. We'd love to talk about it at a further time, and maybe highlight some successes as well. So I just want to thank you again, Cory. This was fantastic having you on today, and thank you everybody for dialing in, and we will catch you next week.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Bye.